Good afternoon. My name is Shannon Albakiel. I'm Managing Director of the Center for Public Interest Advocacy and Collaboration, or CPAC. And we are so thrilled to host our Daynard Fellow this fall, Anjali Waikar. I hope that many of you were able to hear her tremendous lecture on Monday and or meet with her, or still have a chance to this afternoon. And we're so glad you could join us for today's roundtable event, Environmental Justice, Case Studies in Policy, Advocacy, and Litigation. I will turn it over to our distinguished facilitator, Lee Breckenridge. Lee Breckenridge is a professor of law emerita here at NUSL and affiliated faculty member in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. At NUSL, she taught courses in environmental law, natural resources law, land use, administrative law, and philosophy law. And for many years, she also coordinated the law school's dual degree programs and supervised a wide range of independent study projects in environmental law and public policy. Before coming to Northeastern, Professor Breckenridge served as the chief of the Environmental Protection Division of the AG's office here in Massachusetts and practiced law in several other government posts, including US EPA. So we're so grateful to Professor Breckenridge for moderating our discussion today.
It's really exciting for me to be able to introduce this wonderful group of panelists today. One of them online, and three of them right here to my right. Anjali Waikar, I think many of you heard about already, but I'm going to tell you a few things about her. Anjali Waikar oversees the legal operations for the Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC. This is, as you probably know, an international nonprofit organization that works to protect public health and the environment. She started her journey with NRDC as an attorney with NRDC's environmental justice team, working to advance health justice on behalf of vulnerable communities. She is one of the original members of the litigation team that sued under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act to ensure that Flint, Michigan residents have safe drinking water. She's dedicated her legal career to advancing the rights of the underserved. She worked at the ACLU of Massachusetts, focusing on immigrants' rights and post 9/11 racial and ethnic profiling, and later at Emeritus and Bluestein in Boston, where she represented and advised primarily nonprofit organizations regarding litigation, employment, healthcare, privacy and data security, education law, and other civil matters, all of which, as you will find out, are completely relevant to her current focus. Before law school, she worked as a South Brooklyn legal services case handler, advocating for public benefits for low-income HIV-infected individuals. And she's also, I don't know how you pull this off, a Cook County Human Rights Commissioner at the same time. Now, to her right is Sofia Owen. Sofia is the staff attorney for Alternatives for Community and Environment, which is an organization that some of you may know about already. It's in Nubian Square, as we now call it, formerly Dudley Square, not so far from here. And she, in that role, provides systematic legislative and regulatory advocacy on behalf of environmental justice communities at the municipal and state level. That's a legal term, environmental justice communities, I do believe. She came to Alternatives for Community and Environment from Community Action Works, where she provided organizing assistance to community groups in Eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and built power to address environmental racism, settler colonialism, and other systemic barriers that disproportionately affect communities on the front lines of pollution. Previously, she was a trial attorney for the Committee for Public Counsel Services. And she has her JD from Northeastern. Staci Rubin, whom some of you may know, because she's been coming back to Northeastern from time to time. Such a loyal and active alum, but every time I see her, she's got a different job. So, and the current one is actually, it was so worthy of congratulations. She is now the Vice President, Environmental Justice at the Conservation Law Foundation, CLF, where she partners with residents of historically marginalized communities to solve our biggest environmental challenges on transportation, zero waste, lead poisoning prevention, and climate justice. She works with CLF staff in all the New England states to embed environmental justice throughout CLF's culture. There's an ongoing task. Prior to CLF, Staci served as senior counsel and hearing officer at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, where she specialized in distributed generation, public records matters. And before that, she was the senior attorney and director of the environmental justice legal services programs at Alternatives for Community and Environment. You already know. Owen was, yeah. So she provided legal representation for community-based groups. And I should back up. I forgot to say, Sofia, that you're currently on EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, EJAC, which is actually a pretty exciting turn of events there. You'll have to tell us some more about what they're up to. Two of these folks went to the Vermont Law School Masters in Environmental Law and Policy program. It's really been a great, since I advised that group over many, many years, it's really gratifying to me to see where these folks are. Finally, we've got Deborah Jackson. Brad promised. Here she is on the screen. And I'm thrilled that we have her here with us today. She's actually with us here at Northeastern, even though she's there in Georgia, I do believe, at the moment. She has brought a really rich and varied experience to her new role as the managing director of Northeastern's Center for Law, Equity, and Race Clear. She served for 8 years as the mayor of Lithonia, Georgia, from 2012 to 2020. And she served previously as city attorney and then council member there. She was active in environmental justice efforts to stop the building of a biomass gasification plant in the city and county, and served as an advisor to Citizens for a Healthy and Safe Environment, CHASE, prior to becoming mayor. She was named in 2014 Who's Who in Black Atlanta, section on environmental and sustainability. And during her tenure as mayor, she established a variety of partnerships to produce results for the community, including a dilapidated strip mall conversion in a brownfield to a 75-unit housing project. So it's really fabulous that we've managed to get Deborah to come and talk with us about that type of local experience on the ground. So I'm going to, I think, turn off this microphone and try shouting at you and see whether everybody can hear all right, because I think that will, only one problem, which is this screen is standing in the way. About you all over there. I'd like to start I'm just asking Anjali to give us a little bit of background, a backdrop on environmental justice as a concept. And I'm going to preface that question by saying when I first came into the environmental law field, it was a time when new statutes were being made by Congress. There was a new statute for air and new for water pollution and for hazardous waste management. And the questions of fairness and equity were actually very prominent in the discourse today in the legislation. But the questions of equity and fairness had to do with two main buckets, I would say. First, the government itself was full of military organizations like the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Transportation building highways, the dams going up. It was a question of the mission agencies tromping on public rights broad. Basically, the public was being misserved by government agencies themselves. So there was a demand for accountability there in the name, I would almost say, of the public trust. And there was also a big push in those days to get at the military industrial complex. There was this notion that profit-making organizations, the corporations of America, were making a buck off of, again, the public at large. So there was a lot of thought given to fairness and equity. But environmental justice as a special focus, as we would now use the term these days, has really, I think, evolved. And so I wanted to ask Anjali, could you pick up on that theme and speak about how environmental justice has become such a prominent part of the work that you do and that your organization does?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for those introductions. So, so nice to be in front of you all again today, and excited to be here to be talking about environmental justice. You know, I think the key point that I want to hone in on before talking about NRDC or about my role or whatever, I think the kind of theme that Professor Breckenridge just picked up on is the environmental justice movement is rooted in a long history, you know, similar and as part of the civil rights movement. And I think, you know, if you're going to take away anything from this discussion, you know, things can get super technical, things can get really jargony, but there is also a lot of history here, and it's part of our American history, and it's part of the civil rights movement. You know, over the last several decades, there have been many movements, and this movement has grown out of a series of protests and community organizing. And at its heart, environmental justice is rooted in organizing, and the work has been done and led by the communities and by the organizers, not by the lawyers. And I think that's really important when thinking about, you know, getting involved in environmental justice issues. One of the first kind of areas of protest, or not first, but one of the most prominent issues that came up was in North Carolina in 1982. A group of people started a huge protest over North Carolina's decision to transport a huge amount of soil that was contaminated with PCBs and to dump it at a facility at a landfill in a predominantly Black town in North Carolina. These types of protests have been, you know, started coming up across the country, and I think really sort of serve as the bedrock foundation of the environmental movement. And out of these discussions also came something known as the Hermes Principles. The Hermes Principles essentially was a kind of organizing document, and these guys I'm sure can talk about it in much more detail than I can, but these principles came about with the idea that green groups and large advocacy organizations that are working on these issues have to come to some sort of agreement about how to engage in this type of work. And I confess I had never even heard of the Hermes Principles before I joined NRDC. But essentially, and you can look it up online, but essentially the core tenets are, you know, you ensure that the community and people speak for themselves, that you are inclusive in your advocacy, that you are working in solidarity with the community, not at odds with it, and that you're building a just movement. And there's a commitment to self-transformation. Now, some of these issues, I mean, these are rooted in organizing principles. For us as an organization at NRDC to engage in environmental justice work, we'll get into this, I'm sure, at some point, but it is very challenging. And you can imagine why it's so challenging, because NRDC is a large organization, and most of the all of the environmental justice work arises out of the communities and for the communities and by the communities. So there's an inherent tension there. But when we engage in environmental justice work as an organization, we try to engage in and have at least 3 sort of perspectives and meet 3 criteria. One is that, is the work going to educate the people? It's not a paternalistic perspective. It's a 2-way street about educating the general public, but also that the advocates are learning, and that we are building a movement, and that we're addressing the root of the problem, not just the symptoms. Now, this is sort of what I think all lawyers who are engaged in this work try to meet, and NRDC certainly tries to, and it's, like I said, very difficult in practice when you have 1,000 people in an organization. So I think, I just want to say 2 more things, which is, one is, when we're talking about environmental justice, it's not just about the bad stuff going into the poor communities and the Black and brown communities, right? It's not just about the oil refineries, the chemical plants, the metal shredding facilities, the inadequate housing stock that's all being dumped in one area. But it's also about the absence of good stuff, right? The lack of clean and healthy food, the lack of green open space, the lack of clean air in that area. So it's important to think about these as 2 separate dynamics. And there's a lot of work going on, and I'm super excited to get started. So I guess I'll just end there and pass it back to you, Lee, unless you guys have anything you want to add.
Yeah, well, let's just turn right on down to some follow-up there on the environmental justice concept as you've seen it in your own work.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Anjali, for the overview. I think one of the things that I spend the most time thinking about, apart from the role of lawyers, and particularly of white lawyers, and folks who are not necessarily from the communities that we are working with, is,
Can everybody hear back there? I just want to make sure.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Great.
Thanks.
If you need us to speak up, let us know. Is just how to engage in ways that do ensure that we are working in solidarity with and building power for the people we're advocating for. And one of the things that I love about working at ACE is that we are always thinking not only about the legal avenues that are open to us in our work, but also what is the organizing angle. So as an example, we have an organizing arm at ACE, the Key Riders Union, that is focused on bringing together riders of public transit to build power and change policies that's completely apart, well, that works with, but operates separately from whatever legal avenues we're pursuing. And that group, along with our youth program, were leaders in getting things like the youth pass on the MBTA, and in fighting for things like the low income fare or free fares. So I think that's one thing that is really important. It's not just about doing the legal work and what that looks like. And the other thing I would say is just highlighting the ties to the civil rights movement. Folks might not know, but when Martin Luther King, the weekend that he was assassinated, he was in Memphis to be there with sanitation workers who were on strike after a sanitation worker died. So there are deep roots and connections with the civil rights movement. And the last thing I'll say is just that I think the themes of government agencies not being held accountable continues to hold true today, both on the federal level and on the state level. And an example that I will give that recently came up, which Staci may or may not be able to talk about, it is in Chelsea, Massachusetts, where it was revealed that the Department of Transit had been dumping asbestos without notice to the community. So this continues to happen right here, right now.
Absolutely. I am so excited to be part of this panel with some dear friends, with one of my favorite professors from my New School days. In my work at Conservation Law Foundation, we are a regional environmental organization with roots in the conservation movement. So as Lee was talking about, those times from the 1970s, our organization started even before that in 1966, where it was about how do we conserve right whales. And, that's not typically something that a lot of people in the environmental justice movement care about. But a real issue is for some of the tribes. The indigenous peoples in a lot of ways talk about the right whales, for example, as their cultural ancestors. And so I see my role in this regional environmental organization as pushing us to think about all of the different stakeholders who care about our planet, who should be able to decide what happens in our communities. So as a regional organization that hasn't historically done very well on environmental justice, I came into the organization pretty skeptical, used to work at ACE. We had not great interactions with Conservation Law Foundation and NRDC in those days. And so I really believe that the role of the attorneys doing environmental justice work is to listen. I am not the expert when I come into the room. It's the people who live in the neighborhoods, who know what they want, who have the solutions in mind. They are the experts, and we're there to partner and work together. I want to just highlight some tensions that exist in the work. So we do work up in rural Maine and Vermont, and we also do work in, Chelsea, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island. And so if we're talking about how do we bring renewable energy, potentially hydropower, for example, into Massachusetts that has laws mandating reducing greenhouse gas emissions, what does that mean in terms of generating a new transmission line, for example, that's going to go through indigenous communities, or that is going to have some opposition? It's trying to understand that there is a tension between the different neighborhoods around, and then who has access to wealth and who doesn't. And it's those with access to wealth that historically make the decisions. So I see my role as trying to shift our thinking at Conservation Law Foundation and really prioritize the voices of those who are directly impacted by the work. And when those tensions arise, just sit and listen, ask some questions, sit and listen some more, and keep coming back, because that's how we've been able to achieve some really amazing victories.
Thank you, Staci. And now I'm going to wave at Deborah Jackson, who I hope will herself be able to turn on the microphone. I can tell somebody's been practicing. And we're delighted to have you here up on the screen. I should just, I guess, interject that as we go along, Deborah, when you have additional things to say, I will try to watch out of the corner of my eye, because I can see you on the computer screen, but you might have to wave furiously or just speak up, okay, as we go along, because we want to incorporate you in this roundtable. So the same question for you now.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel discussion. And so currently the Center for Law, Equity, and Race, our primary focus is around the issues of historical racial violence as represented by the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, led by Professor Margaret Burnham, as well as the Criminal Justice Task Force, which is focusing on reentry issues and restorative justice, and that's being led by Professor Deborah Ramirez. However, the background that I bring to the center, as you mentioned in my bio, has been work on the community level around environmental justice. And so, as some of the other speakers have indicated, a lot of those efforts really come out of the community, when I was serving on the city council of Lithonia, for example, one of the council members brought a project that they thought it was a great economic development opportunity. And they said it was the installation of a gasification plant that was going to create jobs and provide scholarships to students and other things. So some of us on the council had questions like, well, what is a gasification plant? You know, just the basic things. And so when the applicant said, oh, it's been around for 100 years, don't worry about it, everyone's antenna immediately went up. And so a majority of the council at that time decided to issue an invitation for the plant to be built there. Myself and at least one other council member said, well, we really don't understand what this is. Let's get some information. And that began the process of organizing a community group that later became CHASE, the Citizens for a Healthy and Safe Environment. We want to have a catchy name for it as well. But it really, you know, speaks to the need so that you have elected representatives who were not willing to listen to the voice of the community. And it became necessary to engage in a serious organizing effort. And one of the things that we found was that people in the surrounding area where that was proposed as the site, that many people had no idea that there was even a landfill in that area, because the real estate agents would bring people in, you know, they would come around on the backside where you would see beautiful homes and subdivisions. But if you went in the other direction, you would see the landfill and all of these industrial areas. So part of it is the importance of just being able to work with community, engage with them. And so while we were subsequently able to prevail in not having that plant sited within the city limits, they then went to the county for a site, you know, which was only, you know, 2 miles away, and you still would have that impact. So just in terms of the importance of being able to help educate the community on a broader level of what environmental justice and as well as environmental racism really means is a very, very important part of the work. And lawyers have some role in that, but you know, it's really not the exclusive role, and very often is not the leadership role.
Thank you so much, Deborah. So there's a little bit of a backdrop to just zero in on some specific themes. I want to ask at least some of you about some particular themes within environmental justice these days. One of them that's become very prominent, although it's not historically the initial focus, which was often on toxic waste dumping. A really current theme these days is climate justice. What is climate justice? How do you bring to bear questions of fairness and equity, environmental justice specifically in that arena these days, looking forward? Well, go, Staci.
Yeah, okay.
I know you've worked specifically on.
I have. So I think some of the climate justice work is thinking about how to make our energy more affordable. So some of the things that happen with the current climate issues is we experience in most parts of the country an incredibly hot summer. You know, the number of days over 90 degrees is so much higher now than it ever used to be. I moved to New England 17 years ago-ish, and I was told you don't need an air conditioner because there's only a handful of days where it's hotter than 90 degrees. It's very difficult to live in Greater Boston without an air conditioning unit at this point. You know, when you run your AC, that means it's more expensive for you to pay your utility bills. And I can tell you from my background experience in utilities, no company ever comes to ask a regulatory agency to decrease your rates. They're always going to ask for an increase. right? And so who pays for that? All of the ratepayers, all of us who pay for our electric bills, but who has the particular difficulty and burden of paying a larger percent of their income? It's low-income residents, it's residents of color, it's predominantly renters who are living in older housing that has poor insulation, that is much more expensive to pay bills. You know, all of that is part of climate justice. I also think about when we talk about energy efficiency programs, those are things that are designed to make our utility bills more affordable. Historically, renters, communities of color, and low to moderate income families have not been able to get, you know, the right amount of insulation. They haven't been able to pay the upfront costs to get more efficient appliances. So all of that is part of climate justice. And I have personally been involved for more than a decade, fighting the same arguments at regulatory agencies, trying to change how decisions are made about how utilities are designed. Some of our work also involves looking at large oil terminals. So oil terminals tend to be concentrated in port areas that are located in communities of color, like Providence, Rhode Island, like Chelsea and East Boston and Revere, Massachusetts, like New Haven, Connecticut. And those facilities are not prepared for those massive storage tanks to withstand really high heat and rising waters. So we have filed several, I would like to say, you know, very interesting breaking litigation cases against these oil companies to say, you need to make your facilities prepared and resilient to a changing climate. And for many years, courts were not allowing those kinds of cases to move forward, but we actually just got a decision at the end of last week in Connecticut that our case in federal district court there is able to move forward. We survived the motion to dismiss stage in every single case that we brought against facilities. So, I mean, that's really about making sure that we are targeting the entities that have historically burdened our communities of color and make them accountable and responsible for their facilities. There's so many other examples. I can think about how Sofia and I have worked together on an opportunity around trees in the Nubian Square area when the City of Boston and State Department of Transportation were looking to change the design of Melnia Cass Boulevard. Melnia Cass was a civil rights advocate, one of the biggest and most prominent civil rights leaders. The road is named after her, and to sort of destroy this street and cut down over 100 mature trees in an area with very few trees, and has a very high urban heat island effect. You know, we were involved in working together to get the city and the state to pause that project, listen to neighbors who wanted to preserve these trees, just so that there was shade to be able to have access to a place where when they're walking to and from school or work, that they can stand underneath a tree in a hot summer day. So these are all some examples of what climate justice work looks like on a day-to-day basis as an environmental justice attorney.
Can I ask a question? I just wanted to, why were the courts not allowing those cases to move forward, Staci? Were they dismissing them because of standing, or were they dismissing them because of failure to state a claim, or why were they dismissing the cases?
Mostly standing issues, and we've now moved beyond and survived that stage. And I think that the oil companies were making strong arguments that are no longer working, that they were not responsible or they did not know. There's some really good evidence that has come to light that the oil companies knew dating back generations about climate change. And so that's been really helpful to us. It's been a lot of discovery fights.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I just wanted
An old litigator that I am, I'd like to know, and what statute or legal requirement at the federal level were you invoking in order to come forward under the citizens suit provisions?
Without getting too deep into environmental law, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or RCRA, so one of the hazardous waste statutes arguing that there's going to be pollutant and the Clean Water Act, that these facilities are going to leak cause harmful metals to be, put into our oceans, and that's going to violate multiple federal laws.
There you go. Lucy will pick up on it
Yeah.
next in her next class. Let me ask Deborah, if it's at all relevant, this biomass plant that you were involved with, I assume was at some level perhaps an energy generating facility that was supposed to bring all kinds of good things to the region.
Yeah, so the main thing that it was supposed to be generating, you were using the waste from the county. When they went to the county, they were going to use the waste from the county landfill as a way of creating methane gas. And so one of the things that, that really became an issue in terms of working with the state environmental agency, which is known as the Environmental Protection Division here in Georgia, is that when they issue permits, it's done on an individual and case-by-case basis. And there's no consideration given to the cumulative impact of all the previous permits that have been issued. And that was one of the things that we were arguing, was that the area was already fairly saturated with all types of toxic industries, and that they couldn't just look at, give a permit based on that one facility, but really needed to factor in all of what was currently happening in the area. And then we found, that there really is not a provision for that. So, which is one of the, I think, one of the shortcomings of, the whole permitting process.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say that we were successful. So when they did go to the county, and the county did approve it, despite, our very loud and vigorous opposition, that it was necessary to file a lawsuit. But because of resources, we end up, just getting it dismissed. But the applicant really didn't have the funding in place, and so the project eventually died on its own. But it, was the whole process lasted, almost 4 years before it finally died.
4 years, that's short in environmental law, isn't it?
Okay, so yeah, super briefly, so ACE, and I should have said this, as we mentioned, we're based in Roxbury. We're a very small organization. There's 7 of us on staff, 2 lawyers now as of 2 weeks ago, and the rest are organizers, and several folks are people who were, half our staff is people who were members of the organization first and participated in our programs and have joined our staff. We are Black-led and predominantly Black staffed, so it's just the 2 lawyers who are not Black. And that is really important when you talk about the EJ or climate justice or whatever kind of justice. I think being led by the groups that you are serving is critically important. We are part of both state and national alliances that are focused on climate justice. And some of the things that I think are most important about that concept to me is when you're thinking about changing policies, like as Staci was saying, what gets cited where, and how we're getting our energy, that the communities that have been the most burdened by and least served by our energy infrastructure are being given control over where their energy comes from and where the benefits go. And so that applies in the energy efficiency context, making sure that renters and low to moderate income folks are actually benefiting from programs that we are all paying into if we get a utility bill. Also, not burdening other communities of color and low income communities when we decarbonize or our own infrastructure gets greener, is another thing that I think about a lot. And then just a really brief example in our work, I think the other piece that we think about a lot is whether there are opportunities to change the power dynamic and engage in more of a collaborative governance approach. So an example is we, for the last almost 3 years, have been involved in a process in partnership with the city of Boston, thanks to funding in part, at least at first, from NRDC, to come up with updates to the city's building emissions related ordinances. And we helped co-draft an ordinance to decide, to help lay out the city's process for reducing building emissions. And we ensured that they had a stakeholder group that was community centered, and they did 4 community meetings that were led by a facilitator that was trusted by community, that got feedback from them about what the issues were of importance to them. So that broke down things. So when you say building emissions, a lot of that stuff is super wonky and who cares? But when you talk about to people in the community about what their experience is with issues related to air quality, everybody has asthma or knows someone who has asthma. Lots of people live, as Staci mentioned, in housing that is poorly ventilated or falling apart. And everyone is concerned about gentrification and displacement. So we were able to hold the city accountable in a different way in the drafting process of the regulation, and now in the regulations process, they're drafting the regulations for the ordinance to make sure that there are commitments to push back on some of the things that folks are afraid about, like their utility bills going up, like retrofits making properties more desirable, rents going up and people being displaced. And also something that we've learned from work that happened while Staci had my job was in drafting a previous ordinance around diesel emissions. We haven't had the implementation and enforcement that we would like to see on that. So we fought for a community oversight board, or an oversight board that has representation that is 2/3 community aligned. So out of however many people there are on the review board, 2/3 of those people have to be nominated by and accountable to community-based organizations like ACE. And then the last thing I'll say is climate justice is fighting against what we call false solutions. So things like offsets, which if folks don't know what they are, it's basically an option for companies to continue to be able to pay to pollute. Like the example that's given is you can pay to plant trees in the Amazon, and then that counts to offset whatever your carbon emissions are in your building here in Boston, but that does nothing for us locally here. So we fought to keep offsets out of the policy, and I'm pretty proud to say that did not make it into the policy and was never an option from the time that the ordinance was introduced.
Great. I don't have a lot to add, but I just wanted to kind of pivot back to the original question, which is, what is climate justice? And I think kind of at its heart, we're all seeing and feeling the impacts of climate change across the board, every single one of us. But the sort of principle is that the communities that are bearing the communities, low-income communities, Black and Brown communities, should not be bearing the brunt of us, trying to address climate change and having to cover more than everyone else, right? And so I think that's really at the heart of it. And I think for me personally, not coming into this work from a environmental background and not, being a climate activist before, I think one thing that's just so obvious is that it is super wonky and it is super complicated because there is work on every single level. We have staff at NRDC working on buildings, but not just buildings. Some work on new buildings, new construction, some work on old construction. Then you have people working in cities and working with only certain cities. Then you have people working with states, but only certain states, because those are the places that have the highest impact on global emissions, right? And then you've got the people working on the federal level. I mean, if you want to get involved in this stuff, there is a million things to be doing. And I think that for me, the toughest part is how do you penetrate it from the outside? Like, where do you even get started? I'd love to know from all of you what you think, but that might be a little bit outside the scope of this conversation. But I think it's worth talking about, certainly, as you know, if you guys are involved in your Environmental Law Students Association, I think these are ripe conversations to kind of start gathering and sharing stories about how you can get involved.
Are there any particular questions that any members of the roundtable want to ask each other at this point? You can think about it. If you
Yeah, I'm
go
happy.
ahead.
I'd love to hear what, some of your an example of your most meaningful campaign or case, and sort of what tools you use to accomplish that success. Litigation, legislation, organizing, combination.
I'll start. So I think the most meaningful environmental justice matter that I worked on, and it was my experience has been very limited, was working on the Flint water crisis. When I joined NRDC in 2015, I had intended to be working on other issues involving indoor environmental justice issues. But the heart of EJ work is, getting the help from you have to be invited in, right? It's not about going in and telling communities what you think they need to do to be better, cleaner, or whatever. So we then were contacted a few months after I started from the community groups in Flint, essentially saying that they were concerned about the quality of their drinking waters. And at that point, many lawsuits had been filed, but it was sort of all over the place in terms of legal theories. And the ACLU of Michigan actually said, you should bring in NRDC. NRDC has this expertise in environmental laws. So we came in, invited, met with the various community groups. And one of the biggest challenges at the outset was nobody knew who we were, right? I mean, I barely knew who we were when I started. And here we were, in Flint, we don't have an office there, we don't have staff there. And that was definitely one of the biggest challenges, was just at the outset, establishing the relationship and the trust, because community doesn't want to know that we're going to come in and just assess things and then leave, right? They want to know that you're there for the long haul, that this is a relationship that is going to last and that we're committed and we're going to be there for the long haul. And so that took a lot of time. It took a lot of time to build trust. And this is a community that was completely understandably distrustful of anyone in government, of anyone in so-called authority. And that took a lot of face time. But eventually, with the help of a lot of resources and a lot of people and a lot of just human power, we eventually, and a lot of just amazing work from the community who were rallying, continuing to rally. We brought a suit under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, and essentially alleging that there was a violation there, that the city and the state's officials had violated the Safe Drinking Water Act. And eventually, after many, many years, the case ultimately settled. And that case settled. It was the only environmental case that was brought in Flint. A lot of cases have been brought, a lot of criminal charges have been brought, a lot of tort, related, education-related suits have been brought. But this was the only environmental one, and it resulted in a $100 million settlement that did not go towards money damages, because we don't sue for money damages, but we brought it for injunctive relief, which essentially means that we are asking the court to issue an order to fix the problem, not to put money into anyone's pocket. So the fixing of the problem was a request to essentially remove all lead service lines in the city. And that work is continuing to be ongoing. The court's current order is as of September 30th, although lead lines should be out. Let's see what happens. But people have been working tirelessly, just on the settlement phase of it, as much as they've been working from the get-go. So that's my example.
So there's two things that I wanted to talk about. I mean, one of them, I sort of touched on the BERDO, the building emissions process, which I am immensely proud of, and builds on the history of previous ACE folks like Staci and others. And the thing that I didn't say before that I think is really critically important about this is that we were really thinking about how we make policy, but with organizing in mind and with building power in mind. And I think often as lawyers, or even just working with the community, the response from folks is, well, okay, who are we suing? And like, can you get us an injunction for this? And sometimes that's not actually the most useful way to go. Like litigation is so expensive and time intensive. And there are ways that you can be involved in making policy that bring community into the space that decisions are made. Like we did with Virgo, we had 4 community meetings where over 200 residents showed up to give the city of Boston their input. There are 4 meetings happening this fall, just on one phase of the regulatory process. And we're having focused meetings with a bunch of community organizations, including ACE. One of them is tomorrow. So if folks are thinking about, you know, how you plug in, as Anjali mentioned, like this can look so different and it doesn't have to be litigation. You know, obviously understanding the way that federal law and state law and municipal law work and knowing how to litigate is really important, but that is actually not most of what I do. But the other piece that I wanted to talk about, and maybe we can partner on this, Staci, is about the passage of the climate legislation, not this session, but in the previous session, so a year ago in March, which included historic environmental justice provisions, including the baseline definition of what an environmental justice population is in Massachusetts, the creation for a second time of an advisory council to advise the governor and the state's Department of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and some other protections and improved provisions to enable environmental justice populations to be better supported in processes around siting. And also, lastly, I know we talked a little bit about cumulative impacts, and there's also a provision to require the state DEP to consider cumulative impacts in air permitting. But this was the result of a 20+ year fight led by ACE, Neighbor to Neighbor, Green Roots, the Coalition for Social Justice, and the North American Indian Center of Boston, along with allies, including CLF, and has, you know, countless people who have gone unnamed and unrecognized, and was a huge victory for us last year.
Absolutely. Having an environmental justice law is a really important tool in the toolbox for lawyers. So yeah, it was an incredible victory.
At this point, I'd love to just open it up to a broader discussion of you all, I'm sure, have some thoughts. Carl.
Sofia said something very, very challenging in passing, and I'd like to invite you to say more about it if you would. And I'm not sure I fully understood, but in the building emissions process, I gathered the idea is that you enact regulations that require building owners to improve facilities so that their emissions are less environmentally damaging. Perhaps the conditions inside the buildings are more habitable for the residents. So those are things that are fervently to be desired. And I'm sure that the communities who serve really want them. But you did, in passing, say that there was a little bit of concern, A, that it was going to raise the electricity bill, and B, that it's going to make the properties more desirable and therefore targets for gentrification. So the bottom line is that once again, there's the risk that well-meaning progressive reform actually is going to hurt the people intended to help. What can we do about that? What are the strategies that can be used to prevent that knock-on effect, which would be very scary for your communities?
That's a great question. And really, I mean, there isn't I don't have a great answer, unfortunately, because we live under capitalism, and at the end of the day, we don't have rent control, we don't have strong rent stabilization policies, in the city or statewide that will protect people from being taken advantage of by landlords or developers who just want to flip properties. But so I guess I should say ACE is also a part of housing justice coalitions, and we are working closely with organizations that are also mobilizing their bases around statewide protections and city protections for folks to enable them to stay in their homes. But to your point about what we do in terms of the policy, I think just one of the things that has been the biggest headache is just actually trying to get people from the different city departments to talk to one another. Getting folks from the Boston Planning and Development Authority and the Department of Neighborhood Development to sit down and talk is one thing, but getting them to talk to the environment folks who are the ones actually doing the implementation process for the regulation is mind-bogglingly difficult. And so breaking down those silos is one thing. I think as people who care about policy, like understanding that all of this is intersectional and is all interrelated, and encouraging bureaucracies as much as possible to talk to each other is super important. And then the other thing that we have been doing, and this is partly because my boss's background is in doing community work in the fair housing space, is really pulling on the requirements that are on the city of Boston because they get money from the federal government to comply with their obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, which is a federal requirement under the Fair Housing Act. So if you want to do EJ work, you kind of have to be fluent in everything, or at least know who you can go to ask about that. So I am regularly contacting people from Greater Boston Legal Services who do housing work, or I talked to Staci and others who have more of the background in some of the energy regulation of traditional environmental law, and then just having, I think, thinking outside the box and being creative and reminding people that it is possible even within regulations to push boundaries and further conversations is really important. But we did run into the issue of the city saying, you don't have the authority to keep people's rents from going up. And we don't expect them to, but we want them to be having conversations that don't result in the policies that we're making having the consequences that we fear they will. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Hi. Yeah. This is Jeff. I could just jump in for a minute. I mean, so on that point, it really speaks to the need of, having a holistic approach from the beginning, as we develop policies, because, while we want to address the issues of environmental injustice, that, sometimes the policy can have a negative, impact. And so that needs to be part of the conversation, I think, in the planning in the beginning, as opposed to, at the end of, we have this great policy that's going to address these issues, but this is the negative consequence, and it kind of becomes a self-defeating kind of. So not that it's an easy answer to that, but I just think it just requires, more thinking on the front end about what the potential negative impacts would be to see if those could be addressed and minimized before the policy is actually developed, so that they work in tandem as opposed to, contradictory.
I also just want to pick up on the intersectionality piece, just to note that this issue also implicates the workforce and thinking about who has access to jobs. The clean energy or clean buildings space, historically has been almost exclusively left to white men, middle class, sometimes unionized workers. And there are, people formerly incarcerated, people of color, women, immigrants, limited English proficient residents, veterans, all of these people who just haven't been able to break into the clean energy workforce sector. So there are systemic policies that can be paired with the building emissions reduction ordinance, which I know that ACE is thinking about, to make sure that we are creating spaces to make sure there's room for people to enter that workforce, get high paying jobs, that will then, lift up the experiences for those families. And then, one of the key issues is how do we get rid of our fossil fuel heating systems? How do we get to electric heat pumps, for example? The state and federal government should be providing a much higher incentive available for low income and renter occupied buildings to make this happen. So it's really about understanding, as Deborah was suggesting, the holistic piece from the front. And then, as Sophia said, getting the right people to the table to collectively think about the full package of solutions.
Yes, go ahead and back.
Hi. I wanted to follow up on Attorney Weiker's question from earlier, which is what advice do you have for getting more involved in environmental justice work and for broadening your skill set in order to be better able to do this work?
Yeah. So I guess I was asking you guys, and now you're asking me. So yeah, no, I think so. I think it's a great question. I think the first thing is look in your neighborhood, like look local. What is happening in your community, whether it's your Northeastern community, the city that you're living in. I think that we sometimes overlook what's happening on a local level because we think, oh, the big names, like I know that, that organization's name or that organization that's working on a federal level or national level. But I think really the resources should be and can be funneled down to the local level because as we've described, this stuff is very, it's locality based at a fundamental level. The other thing is that, kind of launching off my talk on Monday, I think the skill set of community lawyering as you are all engaging in law school is going to be really valuable. And the reason being that it's about understanding and being aware of the power dynamics at play as a lawyer, sometimes as a white male lawyer coming into a community, what those dynamics are and acknowledging it and being sort of mindful of what you're bringing to the table when you're coming in. And I think really thinking about your being self-aware and thinking about those aspects and getting practice in it and just talking about it, I think will go a long way. No matter what kind of law you practice, but certainly in terms of working with EJ groups. And then finally, and I'd love to hear what you guys think, I think understanding and knowing what organizers do, which sounds really basic, but I think is really important because I feel like there's a tension there and that comes from maybe lack of knowledge and lack of awareness. I hear a sigh, which sigh. Yeah, is that? Yeah. But I think that's what and that I think also just goes to talking to people. When you talk to people about their jobs, ask them. If you don't get it, it's okay. Ask people what they do and be willing to kind of be vulnerable and unpack what it is that they're doing and saying, because it's only until you understand it can you do something about it, and especially in the environmental space.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would say, I think a key skill is to know your own identity and be really clear in that. Don't try to be someone that you're not when you're trying to talk to anyone. I mean, that goes for any future boss, it goes for a community-based organization. I mean, I identify as a white, cisgender woman. I'm a mom. I don't try to go in and pretend that I know what the group wants or needs or that I understand them. That's never helpful. I think just bringing your true identity and acknowledging that and sort of understanding racial dynamics. If I'm the only white person in the room, I like to acknowledge that and just say, I'm here to listen to you. You're the expert. That's really important to me. So I like to just bring that and acknowledge it. And then I think that environmental justice connects to so many different jobs. So if you end up in a law firm as your first job and you are working for a partner that's trying to develop some large scale, expensive building, you can say, let's do outreach. Let's go figure out who are the community-based organizations. Let's go talk to them and see what they think about what we're trying to do. So I think that you can think about an environmental justice perspective, no matter what your job is. So just think about that, because you can do really good work regardless of your job. It doesn't matter if you work for a government agency. It doesn't matter if you're the mayor, it doesn't matter if you're have sort of the least important job in whatever space you're in. You can always ask questions and just try to push your colleagues to think about things in a different way and be open to those conversations. You might actually make a huge difference by raising those questions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think knowing your story and why you care specifically is really important. And that is something that will develop with time. I think, as Staci pointed out, it's possible to do this work wherever you are. And, if you are, particularly, I think if you are working for a firm or for government, well, especially if you're working for a developer, you actually have to do outreach now on EJ, but before a proposal. But just knowing where local organizations are, and if you can't find one, there's probably some sort of an informal group of folks that are working on issues. So just knowing what the issues are locally. I would be remiss if I didn't say, ACE is right here in Roxbury. We're 10 minutes from where we are right now. We do take co-op students and we give tours of the neighborhood for anyone who wants to come and learn. We do ask for a donation associated with those, but if you want to learn more about the history of Roxbury and the history of environmental racism right here in Boston, please come talk to me. And then the other thing that I was going to mention, it relates to if you're going somewhere else, find out where the local organizations there are, because this work is everywhere. I think that's everything.
Thank you.
I have one more thing, two more. Sorry. One is I think the environmental law students group is supposed to be meeting right now, right? I hope that group now. Oh,
We're here.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I hope this is your meeting. And also I feel like there's a great, tour coming up with your group, hopefully. And then the second thing is, since we have a former mayor on our panel here, I also just want to put a plug that I think it's important to vote elected officials who come from the community, and I think that's really important that people in power be the ones who are speaking from the community who are from there.
And one last thing, your comment about organizers reminded me.
And then I have 3 more things.
No, I think having a respect for organizing, even if it is not something that you entirely understand or you want to do yourself, is really important as an attorney. There's almost no legal victories that have been won without organizers doing a lot of really hard, really thankless work. And often it is in fact organizing that gets us the results that we need. And I'll give a really quick small example. Staci talked earlier about the tree canopy and trees in Boston, and recently the city has been doing some updates to one of the largest parks in Roxbury, and community members were deeply concerned about the fact that in the proposal to update the park, they were planning to cut down almost 70 trees and to put in an artificial turf field. And residents were understandably quite upset about this. You don't know the issues with artificial turf, you can Google that later, but there are a myriad of environmental and health issues around that. And just for some context, Roxbury is one of the neighborhoods with a heat island. It has the second highest asthma rate in the city, and air quality is very poor. And there are very few green spaces where people have access to the mature trees that are in Malcolm X Park. So community members came to us and said, what can we do? And there wasn't really a legal option other than for us to write a letter to the city and say, we've heard concerns from people. What are you doing about this? And raising some of the equity issues. And then it was organizing by our staff and by residents that resulted in some oversight from city council that ended up bringing about changes to the proposal so that only 29 trees were cut down. And we don't know why exactly this decision was made, so I'm not going to take complete credit for it, but Mayor Wu did announce that no more artificial turf will be used in parks in the city. So yeah, which is huge. So even if it wasn't the direct result of our organizing, we know we played a part in that. But that's just one small example of the collaboration between the organizing and the legal work.
Yeah, and if I could just echo, I think that it is really important to, start where you are in terms of, getting involved in this work, and just in terms of, understanding what are the issues that are going around in your community. Many small municipalities have planning boards and zoning boards, and, that may be an opportunity because they're always, in search of people to serve. And so those might be some additional opportunities, just to kind of become familiar with what some of the issues are. And it's always amazing that you have a group of people, someone thought it was a great idea to cut down 70 trees and put in artificial turf. It's like, how did they come up with that? But it just, shows that it's important for the community to always be vigilant. So even if you are electing good people and putting them in office, they have administrative staff that really implements those policies. And so you have to go beyond just the folks who are elected, but also the people who are actually administering policies to see what is actually taking place.
So true.
Okay. I was curious about something that Deborah Jackson that you said. It's a lot of times it seems that environmental justice is pitted against the promise of jobs, and like there are narrative tensions between environmental justice and what is kind of characterized as economic justice many times. So I was wondering, from your perspective as an official, when you were dealing with that, I mean, can you talk a little bit about that, and anyone else who wants to?
Yeah, so that was really a very important point that came up, that there were people, because it's an economically, underserved community, people were very excited about the prospect of all of these jobs. So first of all, the number of jobs that they were indicated was totally out of line of what was actually going to happen. And then, but what we had to explain to people is that we want economic development in our communities, but we don't want development that's going to be harmful to people who live in the area, people who work there, as well as the environment. And so you have to factor all of those things in. So some people did understand it, but other folks, they were just interested in having the opportunity to, to be able to get a job. So you do have that tension that's there, but part of it is, how do you help educate people as well as look for alternative development to bring into the area that is really going to create jobs that are meaningful to the people who are employed, as well as not harm the environment and the surrounding community.
I have, or not.
But the second point is within time.
Okay. Just to say, I've been fighting multiple fossil fuel power plants in my time, and I remember being a very young attorney showing up to a public hearing with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and we had about 100 community members opposed to it, and about 400 union people flown in from not even within the state to support it. And so we didn't do the homework we needed to do from an organizing perspective, for example, to block that. So that's the early work that I would say to make that happen. And then for those of you who rely on the MBTA and just experienced the orange line or the green down partial shutdown, the MBTA is in desperate need of hiring. And so we work with a bunch of organizations, community-based organizations, to try to get people hired, and particularly people of color hired into these, well-paying jobs. The T is not the best place to work right now, but they are in desperate need of people. And we've been pushing for good job training and bonuses and things that really help people get access to jobs, and then to change the culture so that it'll make them want to actually work at places like the MBTA.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you to all the panelists. I think we're out of time, but